Flintlock Musket Build Guide. This is the design by CarneyRex. This is the flintlock version, not the snap cap version. This is the full-length musket version. It's actually a really easy build. You got our hardware here and our prints, so a full DIY kit here. The only thing we're going to need to build this thing is super glue, lube for the air seals, and a Phillips screwdriver. And I find it helpful if you have some deburring or post-processing tools for your 3D prints, depending on how they came out, like pliers, picks, or files. And in this build, I'm going to use electric driver because it is way faster and the screws can be pretty long. I'm first going to start with my barrel. So I'm going to grab my brass barrel or whatever material you may have, my 012 O-ring. Now this is going to be your smallest O-ring out of the three, so your 012. I'm going to grab my barrel cap and my collet. We have our barrel cap, our collet, O-ring, and brass. I personally think that it works best to glue the brass into the collet and the O-ring system because it does not retain super tightly. So I'm going to take my brass and I'm going to score up a little bit on the end so that way my super glue has something to adhere to. Okay. Then I'm going to insert that into the cap and I'm going to put the O-ring on the end, 012 O-ring on the end, and carefully don't cut yourself on the brass, it can be sharp. Then we'll put the collet on, we'll slide that O-ring down. Put the collet. Tighten that really hard, keep the brass in there. And do a 1, 2, 3 O-ring on the back like so. And that we'll put on the plunger tube. Before we lube it, we'll give it a twist, get that O-ring seated in there, and we'll just twist it on into place. Just like that. Then we'll line up our holes. Gonna go our stock front A, and make sure it's clear of supports on the inside, and then install our barrel band A. Then we're gonna do our stock front B, which is going to be the long brown, or the long stock piece with the angle on it. And we're going to slide that so the angles line up like that. Our barrel body B, which is gonna be the large piece with the thinnest walls and the 3 holes on top. I'm going to line up those holes there. Then I'm going to install my tube assembly. Perhaps. Okay, so those holes will line up. I'm going to do an M5 by 10 millimeter screw with my Phillips driver. Gonna make sure all those are lined up, and then I'm going to do 2 M5 by 20 millimeter screws into either hole on the bottom. There you go. Just like that. And then I'm going to continue on the front with, I'm gonna do barrel body C. I'm gonna line up the teeth, the grooves, and I'm gonna rotate so it kind of locks into place a little bit. Then I'm going to do my barrel band B. Again, make sure there's no supports stuck in the stock front B. Install my barrel band B. Then I'm going to install the last piece of my stock front C. And then in this groove in here, I'm gonna drop a 016 O-ring on top. I get that to focus. There you go. Drop an O-ring on there. get it lined up. Then I'm going to install my barrel band C. Then I'm going to install my barrel body D, and it's got that cutout again on the side, and it's got this little nub I like to put near the top. So we'll put the cutout lined up to the front sight, then rotate it into place. And then we can do an M5 by 10 millimeter and an M5 by 20 millimeter. Doing one short, one long just makes it easier to take off the end in case you get a jam. And if we did that right, it should be nice and straight. This one turned out nice and straight. And you get that by not over tightening the screws. And I did forget that you do 2 more M5 by 20s here in the middle as you go. Then the very end is just our muzzle, and it has a hop-up tab which goes facing the top. So the hop-up tab goes facing the top. And that's it for the front half. We can also do our sling swivel now if we want. And that is going to be an M5 by 20 screw through the side. And I'll drive it through most of the way. And when I feel it come out the other side, I will then put on one of my M5 narrow nuts. Oops. There we go. Sling swivel. Okay, sling swivel. So there's the front assembly. Now I'll move on to the bayonet and the plunger and then the hammer mechanism. So I will set this aside and I will do the bayonet, which will consist of the middle, the end, and the tip. So one will be narrow, and that is the end, and then we have the top, which is the one that has the line, and the middle, which is the one that has a hole on either side. We also have our ram cap, and that gets assembled together with these 4-inch threaded rod segments. And I like to do this in my drill. If you don't, then you can use a couple pairs of pliers, but I will simply install the rods into the middle. And then I will put on either end. And the narrow end you can fit in a drill as well. There's our ramrod. And then my OCD, I like to line up the print lines together, so I'm going to continue to twist it until the lines line up, so the hexes are one continuous shape. And then I will install and glue on my cap. Let's do a couple drops. And the cap. And then we can test fit, make sure the ramrod fits into the front of my musket. There you go. Next, I will do my plunger assembly, which is going to be my plunger cap, my 5-inch skinnier threaded rod, and 2 632 lock nuts, and 2 1 2 3 O-rings. So I'm going to put a lock nut onto the end of the rod, put that into the middle of my plunger, and then I'm going to put the cap on with the other lock nut, and I'm going to tighten those together So I'm gonna tighten this lock nut down and see which lock nut gives first. So it looks like this one is giving first because I can see that the rod is coming out this side and it's staying in the same position on this side. So I'm going to hold the rod now, the threaded rod, and I'm going to tighten it so that way the rod that did not move is fully enclosed in the plastic locking portion of my lock nut. So that way I've got a full lock there so it won't loosen over time due to vibration. And when that is seated all the way, I will then tighten the other end the rest of the way because that side is giving and that's where I want the excess rod to come out, is the back. I'm just gonna tighten that. It's nice and tight so the cap doesn't move. I've got a flush front that's flat and the rod sticking out the end. Then I will do an O-ring for the air seal and then I will wrap the other O-ring on every other slot that'll act as my shock pad. And there's my plunger. Then I will lubricate my plunger tube and insert my plunger. I'll make sure the O-ring is not folded in on itself. And there is the plunger assembly. Next, I will work on the hammer and stock. So I'm going to take my stock, I'm going to take my mid section, and I'm going to put another hex nut into the groove on the stock shoulder. And in order to get this to be very sturdy, I like to super glue the ring on in between them. So I will take another few drops of super glue and put some on where the ring goes. So there's kind of 4 spots there, and put the ring in this orientation on the stock shoulder. Then I'm gonna do just another drop of glue kind of like in that seam there, just so I have glue holding the ring onto the shoulder, which will go onto the mid. I will take the cutout in the back of the mid, line that up to the ring, install it as such, and while holding that together, I'm going to do an M5 by 30 millimeter screw in the bottom of the stock. Now, I have a hex nut in there, so I'm going to keep the stock in the upright orientation, because if I flipped it upside down, that hex nut might fall out of the way, and then it might fall out of its slot. So I'm going to put the screw in the bottom. I'm going to kind of use my stomach here as a third arm, but holding it together, put the screw in the bottom, and then I'm going to drive that through the hex nut to hold the 2 stock pieces together, like that. So now I've got my stock mid and my shoulder nice and tight together, they don't wobble, and then I can assemble the rest of the stock. So pretty easy, the butt plates, it's just M5 by 10s, don't over tighten them or you'll strip the parts. So I've got 3 M5 by 10s. And then another one on the top. So butt plate B, there you go. Then we can do our trigger, which is going to be an M5 by 20, and that's going to go into that middle hole of those 3 holes there. I'm going to tighten it down, but not so much that it doesn't pivot. So then I'm going to loosen it until it swivels freely. I'm going to do the same thing with my catch sear, M5 by 20. That's going to go in the hole on the right hand side. Loosen that so that way it still pivots freely. Then here I can do my trigger guard, which is going to go on the bottom with an M5 by 20 in the front and an M5 by 30 in the back. Okay, and here you can also do your swing swivel, your sling swivel, your whatever it is. So another M5 by 20 into the side that has the round portion, not the hex portion. Didn't mention that earlier, but we'll put the screw into the side that is the round side, and we will drive it through until we feel it kind of poke out the other side. Then we'll do another hex nut. Hold that together here. Drive the screw through all that. Make sure it still swivels. There we go. Then we can do our rest of our plate assembly. So here I'm going to do my catch, which has a square cut out in the front and a circle on the bottom. The circle on the bottom is for the spring. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our spring and put it on the M5x20 screw that's popping out of the bottom. And then on top of that spring, we're going to put our catch with the square hole facing to the left towards the sear. Just like that. Now it could pop out on you, so make sure you don't let the catch fall out. And then we're going to flip it over, and I'm going to do my side plate with an 1 M5x10 on the top for now. There we go. And then I'm going to partially install my M5x60s on either side. So I'm going to screw them in just about an inch or so. By partially screwing them in, they're not poking out, so I can still install 2 halves later. But now I'm going to set that aside and work on my hammer section. I'm going to start with my plate and my mainspring, and I'm going to install my mainspring. So I've got a square with the circle peg goes into the square hole and to the circle hole there, like this. And if it's really tight, you can use a pair of pliers to press it, like that. So there's our mainspring. Then I'm going to grab my next parts, which is the pan and the frizzen at an M5x20. The pan will go, so the cutout on the pan will go over the spring like that. Then the frizzen will go on top. We want this to rotate, and you can see how it's kind of tight. So we can file the parts, or we can use the screw to kind of give it an offset. So I'm going to put the screw in. And before it goes through the plate, I'm going to bend it a little bit to give some clearance between the frizzen and the plate, and drive the screw the rest of the way, but not over tighten it. So when it gets close to the end, I'm going to just tighten it just a little bit, and then you'll see that the frizzen is now loose. That's what we want. Next, I'm going to work on my hammer, which is the main section of the flintlock. And for this, you can either glue it together or use pins to hold it together, which are just sections of cut filament. So you can just glue it together, or you can use the pins. I'm going to just do the gluing method. So I'm going to just put so where the pins would go, I'm going to do a drop of glue in each one of those holes. And then I'm going to grab my screw and put that in the middle with like kind of the fake threads will be threaded into the middle of that. With my hammer half onto the hammer, hold that together so it'll dry in the proper place. Then I'm going to do another drop of super glue in the little hourglass shaped hole. Then I'm going to do my flintlock stone printed piece. Then I'm going to do another drop of glue on top of that, just a little drop. And I'm going to install my jaw cap and then hold that together. And then on the hole on top of the screw, I'm going to put another drop of glue and put the cap on. The original design used pins, that you can use pins and or glue, but I find that no matter what, you're going to want to use glue, so you might as well just glue the whole thing together. There you go. Then I'm going to install my tumbler key into the hammer so it sits flush with the top of the hammer. And that is going to go onto the large hole of the hammer. And with the hammer all the way closed, we're going to install the tumbler, which is this piece here. And we want the tumbler, with the supports removed, to be oriented so that way the finger of the tumbler is closest to the main spring. It won't be touching, but it should look like this. And then when you flip it around, hold it together, flip it around. We'll do an M5 by 20 screw through all of that to hold it together. But again, do not over tighten so it still rotates. So if we tighten it down, it should still be able to rotate, and you can see it still has some spring to it, and that's perfect. Next, we'll do our sear spring assembly. So we are going to take our bridle, sear spring, our pin or sear B, and we're going to put the pin into the sear. We're going to put the spring onto the bridle so that way the finger of the spring is going towards the pegs of the bridle, and we're going to put our sear upside down so that way the sear pin arm is facing away from us. Then we're going to take that whole thing and flip that upside down and go with the thing in this orientation here. Put it so that way the holes line up on the plate behind the tumbler. And we want to make sure that the teeth on the tumbler are clear of the little arm on the sear. Now you don't want to pull the sear too far that it puts too much tension on the spring and break it. It is just 3D printed, so don't pull up too much when you're trying to set the position. And then just squeeze that together. Again, if it's tight, you can use a pair of pliers to close that gap. And then we'll use an M5 by 10 to hold that together through these holes. So I like to prime the hammer out of the way and then install M5 by 10 through all three pieces, bridle, pan, and plate. So it's nice and tight. And then we can test it to see that when we fire it, it has enough force. So I like to hold on either end and push up on the lock sear so that way it fires. And you should have the pan or the frizzen open when it's impacted. Now you can see this one does not because there's not enough spring for some reason. So I'm gonna make sure that none of my screws are over tightened. So yeah, so by loosening that screw on the hammer, I was able to get much more force on it. And there you go. So yeah, so my hammer screw is a little too tight, but now I fixed that. And then to keep the frizzen springy, you can add the frizzen spring, which goes just beneath the frizzen with another M5 by 10. And that way the frizzen has two positions, open or closed, not some weird in between where it's loose. So we can test it again. Look at that, perfect. Now we'll just assemble it all together. So we're going to take our stock half here. We're going to take our barrel body A, which is the weird spring guide looking piece. I'm gonna put our main spring, and there'll be one cut end and one open end. So, sorry, one cut end, one closed end. I'm gonna put the closed end on our plunger. I'm going to put the barrel body A on top of that with the grooves lining up to the slot, I guess the holes and the little square piece lined up like that. And I'm gonna make sure that my spring does not interfere with the hole. So if I look down the hole, I should not see the spring into the hole. Yeah, so you see your plunger in there and you don't see the spring. So that's what we want. If your spring is in the way, you can use something to kind of push the spring to seat into place. And you can test that to see if it's right by taking your ramrod and while holding the silver piece to the brown piece, but keeping that hole open, you can ramrod the plunger and you should see the plunger cap stick out the end with enough room for the catch to fit. So the catch would go right there on that plunger cap. And we're good. That means that we have enough travel, that the spring isn't too long and the spring isn't in the way. Before we combine the two halves together, we're gonna put on our top tang. And that's just matching the round side to the round groove. with an M5 screw here, M5 by 10. Then we're going to put the two halves together. We're going to be careful that we don't break the top tang by supporting the top tang. That will then slide into the cutout in the barrel body A. So that top tang will go into that cutout, and we'll press it together so that way the brown pieces line up and the top tang is fully seated. And then I like to again use my gut to hold it together while driving this 60mm screw in almost all the way on both sides. I'm going about all but 1 inch of the way in, so the screws will not protrude yet. Then I'm going to take my lock plate and my hammer assembly and assemble that on as well. I'll rotate it this way. That just sits on top, and it won't sit all the way in because you do have a stopper on this side, on both sides, but it doesn't work super well. But that plate is actually just going to sit on top. It's not going to sit totally flush. It'll be sticking out. And then while holding that on, I'm going to screw the screws in the rest of the way. You should feel it go through the lock plate. And then we can test to make sure that the hammer is engaging and the sears are engaging by priming the hammer, and then pulling the trigger should release it. If it doesn't, then the plate might be tightened too far, or it might be sitting skew, or there might be a screw that's too loose or in the way that you can take off that lock plate just by loosening the two M5 by 60 screws partially and then adjusting whatever is on the inside that may be in the way. But this one's working just fine. So then we are going to squeeze the gap here, close these as tight as we can, and putting another M5 by 10 on the top. Now this is the other thing that's holding half of it together with this other screw. So it is important that we try to minimize this gap as much as possible so that way our musket is as rigid as we can make it. So we'll put a screw in the top. I'm gonna do it this way here, holding the screw in, and then while squeezing the barrel parts onto the stock parts, I'm going to squeeze the gap together to kind of pre-tension it a little bit. And I'm not going to over tighten the screw because it can strip because it's not going into a lot of material, just into that clear tube. And there you go. Now the very last thing is to test fire and to assemble our bayonet. The bayonet's really easy. It's just an M5 and an M5, well, two M5s, M5 by 20 in the back, M5 by 10 in the front. We did that because if you drop the bayonet, it would break very often. So now it is more sturdy, but it's an M5 in front. And they're a 10mm in front and a 20mm in back. Just like that. So then we will prime it. And it should catch. Click, went into place. Then I'll be able to load a dart, half-length dart, drop it in. We will load it just until it gets the orange muzzle goes until this line on the end. Right there for a half-length dart. That is as far as you want to go. Do not go any more. If you do accidentally go too far and you load the dart into the plunger by accident, you can access the plunger just by unscrewing the screws that we just installed, which is this top one here and this side one here. You can take it apart, access the spring, swap the spring, or take out your dart or clean your plunger tube. So 2 screws, you can do maintenance, but there you go. Then we'll lock the hammer back and we will fire. Works great. Stow the bayonet, or stow the ram and then install our bayonet. There you go. There is the CarneyRex Flintlock Musket. It says CarneyRex on the side. Beautiful showpiece. Somebody actually ran one of these in the HVZ I went to. Pirate themed HVZ. He did the entire HVZ with like a hammer shot and then a musket. I don't know how he did it, but there you go.